Hi, let's continue our discussion about bond valuation with the concept of yield to maturity. This is the one we use to calculate the present value of the bond or price of the bond. And there are three factors that influence the required rate of return or yield to maturity. One is the real rate of return. It's how much of return investors demand for their money, because once they decide to use some amount of money and buy bonds, that means that that amount of money cannot be used for other purposes. So what is how much they require for the return on this investment? Inflation premium. This one is not up to investors, so they want to be covered in case inflation goes up for the duration of the bond. And that can happen very easily, especially when you buy a bond for 10, 20 years or even more time to maturity. So in this case, what is the level of inflation inside of yield to maturity they are comfortable with for the inflation premium? There are the so-called TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. TIPS, this is a different type of bond, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. Those bonds adjust automatically when inflation goes up. If inflation goes up by 1%, then they make the adjustment automatically for the yield to maturity. Now we have another factor that influences yield to maturity is risk premium. How much investors require as a risk premium percentage to be covered for possible risk when it comes to receiving their money back. Because the bonds can also be issued by corporations, and sometimes, if the level of risk is higher, investors might require more return for risk premium. And given these three factors, this is how they are calculated. Each of them has a percentage, and they add up to total required rate of return. 3% real return of return, inflation premium 4%, risk premium 3%. Total is 10%, 3 plus 4 plus 3. So now suppose that inflation goes up, this is the case here, from 3% from 4% here on this slide to 6%. So that means we have an increase in total required rate of return from 10% previously to 12%. Now the question is, can we calculate the present value of the bond or the price of the bond today? Now remember our discussion earlier. So again, we have a bond, we hold a bond for 10% interest payment. Now the new bonds are going to be issued at 12% interest because inflation went up. Now if we want to sell our bond at 10%, what price are we going to be able to sell it for? Intuitively, because the new bonds are above my bond of 10%, the price is going to be less than 1,000. We discussed that in an earlier recording. So now let's go ahead and calculate the price of the bond for a yield to maturity of 12%. First, we are going to calculate the present value of interest payment, coupon payments using appendix. Remember, appendix D, because this is the one that you received every year. Every year it's an annuity of $100, which is our 10%, because remember, I still have, that's the bond I purchased as an investor, 10% applied to 1,000 principal, that's $100 a month for 20 years. That doesn't change. What it changes is the yield to maturity. So now we are going to use appendix D to calculate the present value of $100 payment per year at 12% interest rate. So we have 100 times, we go into appendix D and equals 20, interest rate 12%. So that's the factor, 7.469. 7.469 times 100, that's the present value of my annuity payment. And now we calculate the present value of the principal payment. And now we are going to calculate using Appendix B, because this is one payment I received at the end of the period. Appendix B, n equals 20, interest rate 12%, but I have to be Appendix B, n equals 20, interest rate 12%, 0.104, 0.104. Well, that's again rounded here. So now we calculate present value of interest payments from the previous slide plus present value of principal payment here. We end up with a total price of the bond of 850, below 1,000. Okay, and this is how we do the calculations. But remember, as a general rule, as yield to maturity goes up, the price of the bond goes down. Now, suppose you have the impact of maturity when the impact on the price and inflation goes down instead of up. Now, again, I have my bond at 10%, and suppose inflation goes down and my current yield to maturity for the new bonds is 8%. Now, intuitively, if I do the calculations again, the price of my bond that I can sell it for is going to go up. You see? Because I have a more valuable investment, 10%, than this one that's current. And again, we calculate present value of $100 annuity. And now I go Appendix D, n equals 20, interest rate 8%. And I have this amount, and then present value of principal payment, Appendix B, n equals 20, interest rate 8%, and I have this amount. And if I add them up, the present value is almost 1,200, 200 more than what I originally paid for. Okay, that's the discussion. And also there is a table that gives you more information on changing yield to maturity. As the yield to maturity goes up, bond prices is going to go down. You see, inverse relationship. Now, another discussion that we can have is the relationship between price of the bond and time to maturity. So in general, if the time to maturity goes up, the price of the bond is going to be affected in this way here. Now, let's see if we have, again, our original investment. I purchased a bond, 10% interest payment, coupon payment, and there are different times to maturity. And you see here, whenever I'm below 8%, suppose current yield to maturity is below my original investment, you see how the price of the bond goes up when the time to maturity goes up. Now, if my current yield to maturity is above the interest rate that I am paid for my bond, then as the time goes up, then the price of the bond goes down. Why? Because I discount the future more and more. You see, 12%. That's discounting the future more, which reduces the price of the bond. Okay. And if you want to do these calculations using the Excel function here, you can do that as well instead of using these appendixes. But for the purpose of this class, knowing how to use these appendixes will help. So our final discussion here on bond valuation, let's discuss about semi-annual interest payments on bonds and bond prices. Well, it's similar to the one we did in chapter 9. Now, if I have 10% interest rate coupon payment, maybe paid $50 per year, because 10% is 100 1 year, and if we discuss twice a year, it's 50 twice a year, semi-annual. That's the case here, semi-annual payment. To convert, before we can use any appendixes, we have to do this conversion. Otherwise, the calculations are not going to be correct. Divide annual interest rate by 2. We did that, 50 twice a year. Multiply number of years by 2. Okay, so now if we have 20 years maturity, then we have 40 periods. That's the one we are going to use with appendixes. And then divide annual yield by 2 because the yield is per year. But if I get paid twice a year, then I have 12% divided by 2, 6%. And now I'm going to use this data to calculate price of the bond. I'm going to use present value of $50 payment every 6 months using Appendix D with N equals 40 interest in yield to maturity 6%. And then using Appendix B, I'm going to calculate the present value of the bond, which is using Appendix B, N equals 40, interest rate 6%. So I'm going to work on a new recording on applications of this theory.